Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Naya Berg, and I am the Executive Director of New York Appleseed. And welcome to our third in a four-part webinar series on the road to integration. Today, we are talking about the challenging the modern tactics of school integration. And we are very excited to have a couple special guests with us. But before I dive into that, and have an exciting lunch hour with every one of you, I wanted to first give a quick recap of where we are on the road to integration. So as I said, we've been putting on this webinar series with our partners at Texas Appleseed and the Appleseed Network. Our first webinar series, we explored the road to integration. We started with frameworks. So we started with the history of school segregation and the history of school, the integration movement as well. We had folks from Integrate NYC join us, as well as Dr. Jennifer Holm, to talk about frameworks that have helped us with really grounding what we mean by integration today. Exploring both past context and why and how those have informed the frameworks that we use today. Dr. Jennifer Holmes has her regional framework that we explored, and Integrate NYC has the 5 R's of real integration, which just so happened to be part of our mission and vision here at New York Appleseed. We then also turned to having a whole other discussion on community integration, where we talked about tying housing and land use policies to school segregation. We had wonderful guests, R. LaRue, Lewis McCoy, as well as Kashana Hill, that joined us in a riveting discussion on land use policy, how that connects to school choice. Really diving into the history of why it is not a siloed event of having both housing segregation and school segregation as well. And that brings us all the way forward to today and the topics that we're having today, which is that I'm very excited about, only because we are moving to what are the modern challenges and tactics of school segregation? How do we overcome them? How do we take action on those? And what better way to have a discussion on ways to take that action than with the authors of the book, Just Action. So I'm excited to say that today we have 2 speakers with us, the authors of Just Action, which I will show up with me right here. The book Just Action was written by Leah and Richard Rothstein. Leah is a accomplished public policy expert, co-author of Just Action, which is the sequel to The Color of Law. Her career has spanned from grassroots activism to high-level policy development with a focus on community development, affordable housing, and community corrections. She has played many roles in various capacities. She has led research at Alameda County and the San Francisco probation departments. She's done consulting for housing developers and government agencies on affordable housing and finance. She is a seasoned community and labor organizer. She holds a bachelor's degree in American Studies from UC Santa Cruz and a master's degree in public policy from UC Berkeley's Goldman School of Public Policy. So please join me in welcoming Leah to the conversation. We also have Richard joining us today. Richard Rothstein is a distinguished fellow of the Economy Policy Institute and a senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute and a senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. His renowned book, which we all, I hope that we know, and if we don't, please go look that one up as well. The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, which examines the government's role in creating residential segregation. His expertise on issues of race and education are well known, but works include Class in Schools and Grading Education. His career has expanded many years. I myself have read many things to educate myself on topic of segregation and school segregation, and so I'm really happy to have him joining us today. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Of course. I always feel that it's good to start with the grounding framework, and so I'm going to throw, I think, what I hope is a simple question out. Maybe Richard, you could start us off, since this is the sequel to The Color of Law, but telling us a little bit of why you decided to embark on this journey of writing Just Action. What made this the natural next step and follow up to The Color of Law?
Well, I actually started The Color of Law because I was an education policy writer. I didn't know much about the housing policy at the time I wrote it. I read in 2007 the Supreme Court decision that prohibited Louisville and Seattle from embarking on a very trivial school desegregation plan using choice to desegregate schools. And the Supreme Court prohibited them from doing it because it said that the schools in Louisville and Seattle were segregated because the neighborhoods in which they were located were segregated. And those neighborhoods were segregated just by accident because of people wanting to live with each other of the same race, or because of private discrimination, or homeowners or landlords not willing to sell to African Americans in particular in white neighborhoods. It called this de facto segregation, and it said where segregation happened by accident, it can only be undone by accident, and school districts are not permitted to take explicit action to desegregate. Well, I read that decision. I thought it was nonsense. As I said, it was based on Louisville and Kentucky and Seattle, Washington. And I remember reading, and this is just one example, reading about an incident in Louisville, Kentucky, where a white homeowner sold a home in his suburban neighborhood to a black family. And the white homeowner was eventually arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year jail sentence for sedition for having done so. And I said to myself, this is not de facto segregation. I began to look into it further, and The Color of Law documented many, many federal, state, and local policies that were designed to ensure that we be a racially segregated society. And this is what's caused our school segregation, because schools are located in segregated neighborhoods. Well, The Color of Law was a history book. It was not written for historians. It was written for a general audience, but explained this history of how our government segregated the country. And people who read it, and I gave many talks like this on webinars and went around the country talking about it, they always had a similar reaction. They said, well, what can we do about it now? And I got tired of hearing that question. So I recruited Leah to help me write a sequel called Just Action, about what we can do about it now. The assumption of Just Action is that although federal policy is primarily responsible for the residential segregation that we know everywhere in the country, once you have segregation, as we have today, it's sustained and reinforced by local policy. And although there's no national will now to take significant federal action to desegregate neighborhoods, there are so many things that we can do in our own communities to make a significant dent in the segregation that exists that could lead eventually to federal policy. But the place to start is local. So we wrote this book, Just Action, to answer the question that people ask, what can we do about it? 20 million people participated in Black Lives Matter demonstrations in 2020. They were white and black, urban and suburban, low income and middle class. They participated in those demonstrations. Many of them then went home and put Black Lives Matter signs on their lawns, but did nothing further. Leah and I thought that this indicated there was an enormous base of support for racial justice. And the problem was that the people who participated in those demonstrations, and of course, if 20 million participated, there were many millions more who were like them. They just didn't know what to do. So we wrote this book to give them some ideas of things that they could do in their local communities.
Absolutely. Thank you. And yeah, I'll give Leah, if you have anything to add. I know that you come back on that community organizer background, but I'm sure you'll have more to add to the conversation as it goes along. And you brought up the history of these court cases, and I think there isn't a more recognized one for I think the public than Brown v. Board, and that is coming up on its 70th anniversary. Brown v. Board of Education, where there are many events happening this May to recognize this anniversary. In what ways do you believe that this fight against segregation has largely remained the same versus how it has changed over the time? And I'll turn to Leah this time to see if she can elaborate on the question.
Yeah, well, I think that the fight against segregation, in the civil rights movement, focusing on desegregating lunch counters and buses, it was sort of easy to see the cause of that segregation, the laws that created, that required the segregation of buses and lunch counters. For example, you could change those laws and the next day, those buses and lunch counters would be integrated. They could be desegregated. Now, the segregation of schools and neighborhoods is something very different. I think today we have to do a lot more work to understand how we came to be segregated before we can start to fight and challenge that segregation. We've ascribed to this de facto segregation myth that, my dad debunked in The Color of Law, that we are a segregated society, that our neighborhoods and therefore schools are segregated, by choice or sort of by just natural accidental occurrence. Now, when we think that that's the case, there's nothing we can do about it. So the fight to challenge segregation sort of dies with that de facto segregation myth. Now, when we start to understand the actual history, that we are segregated, our neighborhoods are segregated by the same kinds of explicit government policies, equally as unconstitutional and illegal when they were enacted as the laws that segregated buses and lunch counters. Once we start to reckon with that history and understand that it was those intentional governmental actions that created our segregated neighborhoods, then we can start to see how to challenge it. But I think what's different in the fight of neighborhood and school segregation today is we have to sort of start by taking a few steps back to understand how we got here in order to understand how to get out of it. And like my dad said, we researched and wrote about dozens of ways that we can challenge and redress, provide remedy for the consequences of segregation in our own local communities. There's a lot of ways we can do that, but we can't do that until we understand that it was government policies that got us here, and that the government and we as residents, citizens of our communities, have an obligation to, advocate that our government take remedial action and to challenge that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when I was reading through Just Action, what I really appreciated was that combination of historical, both the anecdotes, the stories of how folks are really organizing, but as well as what you can take and do with governmental policy. It's funny that you mentioned that, and then Richard, you were talking about how you started learning more The Color of Law on the housing piece because you knew a lot about schools, which is actually very similar to my own, how I've grown. I started with education policy in schools, and I was like, well, okay, but I don't know too much about affordable housing. So I really appreciated that there was a lot in your book that really goes through from anywhere from like credit to in home ownership, and going through what both the history of home ownership, but also what programs are available to help with folks that have been systemically disenfranchised in that aspect now. This is a long-winded way of me going to my next question, which is, so many of us, I think, are either in the school segregation camp and working on school segregation, or working on housing segregation, and often in really distinct silos. So question for you is, if you are concerned about school segregation, how and why should you also be attentive to advocating for against housing segregation as well? And I'll turn that over to Richard. We'll keep popcorning it back.
Okay, all right. Well, housing segregation, residential segregation, is a school problem. If you care about the achievement of African American students, you've got to understand that the reason that on average their achievement is lower than the achievement of white children is because they're locked into neighborhoods. They're going to neighborhood schools, and they're locked into neighborhoods that are poorly resourced and that bring them to school unprepared to take advantage of what even the best schools have to offer. I have many examples I can give you. For example, I remember I wrote one column. I was the New York Times education columnist. I wrote one column about asthma. As you probably know, African American children in urban neighborhoods have asthma at a much, much higher rate than white suburban children. Much higher rate, 4 times as great in some cities. They have asthma because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more industrial facilities nearby, more diesel trucks driving by their homes, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment, more empty lots kicking up dust. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who does not have asthma, not in every case, but more likely to be up at night wheezing and then coming to school drowsy the next day and not being able to perform at the same level as a child who comes to school well rested. Well, that's a school problem, but it can't be solved so long as African Americans are living in more polluted neighborhoods and whites are not. Lead poisoning. We've all seen the stories in the last few years about urban neighborhoods that still receive residential water through leaded pipes, poorly maintained buildings that are chipping lead paint. This has a measurable impact on IQ. That's a school problem. It's not just a residential problem. And so you can go through so many more of these kinds of assaults on children, lack of access to markets that sell fresh and healthy food, that keep children healthy, for example. Police causing stress to children who come to school. Perhaps their brothers or fathers have been arrested for things that white brothers and fathers would not be arrested for. And so children come to school stressful. All of these things add up. And if you have a school where almost every child has one or more of these assaults on their ability to learn, that school can't possibly be able to achieve at the same level on average as a school where children come healthy, well rested, well nourished, in economically secure homes, and not with daily interactions with the police. So these are educational problems. And I came to the conclusion that people who are concerned about educational equality, like I was, have to be focused on residential inequality, because most children in this country have to go to neighborhood schools. They live too far distant. No matter how many buses you build and put on the roads, they live too far distant from other race neighborhoods to be able to have a meaningful integration program that affects very many children without attacking the segregation of those neighborhoods, and in particular, the concentration of lower income African American children in neighborhoods where people like them are the only other people there.
Yeah, thank you. And I think what struck me when you were answering too is that definition of the systemic versus the individual. And sometimes we so often blame the individual when we really should be putting onus on the systemic, and thinking about those systemic inequalities that are out of the control of folks. That I think goes to a lot of conversations that we have as organizers, with people who are like, oh, it's parents' fault, or the bootstraps mentality. There's so many very egregiously hurtful rhetoric around there of why we haven't resolved segregation today, why there hasn't been a snap of fingers and things haven't changed, or that also the argument, right, that with de facto segregation, it's like, well, it is what it is. And so I bring it back to that organizing piece, because I think so much of it is a reframe, and a reframing of how folks approach and think about their own neighborhoods in cities. And you mentioned that some people can't even get to the next school, but here and also New York City, you have very you have segregation within districts where people are right next door to each other, but still might not acknowledge that segregation. Another long-winded way to kind of get back to, I think, Leah, some of those grassroots organizing pieces. Your book, which I loved, starts with community organizing and sort of ends with community organizing. You start with the Chicago Map Twins, and then you end with long-term areas and communities that have worked to sustain integration. Can you delve a little bit deeper into ways that advocates can sort of strike this balance with community engagement, and then having that community engagement sort of influence change?
Sure. Well, both are essential, right? We need, what we argue in Just Action is that to enact the changes that are necessary to redress and challenge segregation, we need an activated civil rights movement around the country of local groups that are formed in our own communities, educated about how we got to be a segregated society, and then activated and taking on issues that they can advocate for to change local policy and programs that impact segregation and could have an impact on challenging and redressing it. Now, we understand that, building this new activated civil rights movement around the country isn't going to be easy. It's going to take a lot of community organizing. And we have to start by building groups in our own communities willing and ready and able to take on local issues. Now, those committees and groups in our own communities, they need to be biracial, multi-ethnic, leadership that's both Black and white. And we understand that in itself can seem daunting because we live in such segregated communities. We don't necessarily have natural social contact with people of other races. Just from going to the grocery store, dropping our kids off at school, we tend to see people of the same race. So if we want to build those cross-race relationships, we have to take some extra intentional steps, some efforts at community organizing to bring people together from other race parts of town. So the Map Twins example that you referenced, we started the book with that as one of a few different examples we gave of groups that have taken those intentional efforts to bring people together and build those social relationships. So the Map Twins project in Chicago was started by an artist named Tanika Johnson. She took the unique layout of Chicago, which is laid out in a perfect grid. So when you fold the map in half, the north side and south side of the same street sit on top of each other. Now, the north side of Chicago is mostly white. The south side is mostly Black. So when she folded the map in half, houses sat perfectly on top of each other from the north and south side of town. She called those homes Map Twins and photographed the homes and did a photography exhibit to show that, these homes aren't that different, but the context they exist in is very different because of the consequences of the segregation of those neighborhoods. Then she introduced herself to the residents of the homes and asked if they wanted to meet their map twin. Most of them said that yes. They met each other, they toured each other's neighborhoods, they started to get to know each other, realized they had a lot in common, and started to look at how their neighborhoods were different. They then formed block twin groups and had, block parties and neighborhood beautification efforts where they supported each other. And they started to learn how, the segregation of Chicago impacted them personally and how it, affected how they see their own neighborhoods and their own city. Now, this was an art project, obviously. So then the next step would be an organizer working with these block twin groups to then start to see and investigate why Chicago looks the way it does, why their neighborhoods are so segregated, why they've lived in Chicago their whole lives and had never met someone from the other side of town or been to the other side of town. And then they could start to look at ways that they could take on issues to challenge that. So we gave other examples in the book too, a group in Winston-Salem that was formed through 6 congregations of a Presbyterian church. 3 were white, 3 African-American. And they formed an interracial dialogue that had, equal representation from the white and Black churches. That group then went on to advocate for a citizen police review board in their city to monitor police behavior and abuse of African Americans, to advocate for including an African American history curriculum in the schools. They built Habitat for Humanity homes. So sort of the coupling of, we need to do this community organizing, build these relationships, build these groups that have some social capital and social relationships they can use to move forward and advocate for change. And then in the book, we give a lot of examples of what those groups could work on. And what we argue in Just Action is there's so many things we can do in our own communities that will have an impact on undoing segregation and remedying its consequences, that it sort of doesn't matter where we start. Any of these groups could just choose one, start there, and really begin to make a change that way.
I'm just curious, because I think of all these great examples that you have in your book. Was there a long list when you were researching this on places and communities that were doing this, or was it easy to select, or was there a lot of different examples? Because I always think of and wonder about about how other places across the country are doing this, and how so often there are a lot of different actions that are overlooked, or it's that idea of like hopelessness of, oh, there's only a few out there that are doing this. So I'm just wondering, in your research experience, if you had a lot of examples and really had to narrow it down.
Yeah, well, I think we had a spreadsheet of all of the topics, and some of them started with, we knew it was a topic we wanted to discuss, and then we found a group working on it. And some of it started with, we knew a local community was working on this issue, and then we delved into the topic or the issue itself. And I would say, from writing this book, I started this project working on this book not sure that we would find enough examples, enough things that people could do to really impact segregation, because it feels so intractable, so overwhelming, so like just the way things are. And I found in researching the book that there are so many examples. There's a lot more that we couldn't fit in, a lot of communities that we couldn't get to that are doing important work on this. We are continuing to write about all of those in a Substack column, which we can give you the information later. But so there is, I'm coming out of the writing process and now speaking about the book everywhere, very hopeful that there is a lot happening around the country, in all sorts of types of communities in all parts of the country working on these issues. So it does give me hope that despite what's happening on the national level in this country, there's a lot of community engagement and appetite and hunger for changing these entrenched sort of ways of being.
Yeah. Richard, I think you're on mute.
Oh, okay. Well, I didn't put myself on mute. Can you unmute me?
You're unmuted.
You're good. You're
Okay.
good.
Let me add that from all these examples that we had, and from the research that we did, we picked examples with the following things in mind. One is, we wanted to pick some examples from everywhere in the country to show that this was not just the kind of thing that people were doing in deeply blue places, but that they were everywhere. If we wanted to write about land trusts, we picked a place in North Carolina, for example. We wanted to always pick examples that showed both African Americans and whites working together, because our view is that we can't accomplish the kind of change we need without that kind of coalition, without that kind of biracial movement. African Americans don't have the political power on their own to change this country. So those are the kinds of considerations that we used, both geographical diversity and to make sure that we showed both African Americans and whites working together in different places.
Thanks. And I think that's encouraging to hear. I think how it intersects with a lot of the work that we do. We have a lot of multicultural settings that we try to make, not only between Black communities and white communities, but also we have a lot that we do with Black and Asian solidarity as well, understanding that there's a lot of work to think about unifying us against a lot of the wedges that are made to sort of in divisiveness, which is part of, I think, thinking about modern era right now. And, you talked about that hope, and I think that hope is important because there is so much divisiveness right now. There's the movement against what I put in quotes, what folks define as critical race theory, which is more often than not what it actually is, but anything from DEI, diversity, education initiatives, There's, just in New York, there was a town hall for Moms for Liberty. It was a very big deal for New York City, because that sort of also popped, I think, a lot of folks' bubbles on New York City being this bastion of liberal ideas. And then you also mentioned court cases, and you have Thomas Jefferson that has been, hanging in the balance, very scarily so, on taking us one step away from really being able to think about student assignment policy that addresses segregation. All that's to say, how can we defy and sort of hold these current groups accountable? Because you talk about accountability in that book, in your book, for things that have sort of happened in the past, and having like banks and different things. How can we hold these current groups that we know are going to go down in the history books as creating divisiveness and being wrong? How can we hold them accountable now? And I will pass it to Richard for this one.
Well, some of the changes that we can make at a local level are legislative, that is, new ordinances. But a lot of them, as you say, are holding the institutions accountable that contributed to the residential segregation of their communities. So, for example, we describe in the book a number of communities that educated themselves about the segregation history of their communities by looking at the deed clauses in homes that called restrictive covenants that prohibited homeowners from selling or renting their homes to African Americans. And these clauses, these restrictive covenants, occur in every community in the country, every metropolitan area of the country. Well, frequently, when you look at these covenants, you'll see that the covenants that were signed to create segregation, to prohibit African Americans from living in the community, were signed and issued by particular banks, by particular real estate agencies, by particular developers. And in many, many cases, those banks, realtors, developers either still exist in the community today, or they've been absorbed by other institutions that still exist in those communities today. And what we write in Just Action is when those kinds of absorptions take place, the acquiring institution not only inherits the financial liabilities of the bank or the real estate agency or the developer that it's absorbed, but it inherits the moral and constitutional obligations as well. So one of the things we advocate in Just Action is that community groups can begin campaigns, careful campaigns, not just shouting, but careful campaigns to press a bank, a realtor, real estate agency, a developer who created segregation in the community to come up with significant funds, which they have, to redress the segregation that they created. Creating a DEI office inside the bank does not create a housing opportunity for anybody, but the banks can redress the segregation they created with significant financial contributions. And that will only happen with a really careful, step-by-step campaign that skilled community organizers know how to create. I'll just give you one example. In the book, as you know, Just Action, we have illustrations of two community groups that had demonstrations against local banks in their communities, because what the banks were doing was issuing mortgages to multi-unit developers that were based on multi-unit apartment owners that were based on those loans being repayable only if the apartment owners evicted existing tenants and brought in higher paying tenants. In other words, they were subsidizing gentrification. And the demonstrations were designed to force those banks to stop issuing those kinds of mortgages that were based on a promise by the borrower to evict existing tenants. That's something that can be done in any community. And it requires a local group that's going to research the kind of mortgages that the bank is issuing. And then if the bank is doing that kind of thing, take action to press them to stop. community pressure, publicity. In one of the demonstrations that we showed, the members of the community group invaded the stockholders meeting to raise this issue. So those are the kinds of things that can be done with banks, realtors, developers who either created segregation in a past generation or who are continuing to contribute to it now.
We only have a couple more minutes until I want to open it up for audience questions, and there's a couple that have rolled in. But I think this webinar series that we've been doing has also been about emphasizing regional and national approaches to this. We've been working alongside Texas and the network to think about the possibilities of how we can bridge our respective work even across states. And so I'm wondering if you, Leah, if you could speak a little bit more to strategies that would encourage sort of regional and national advocacy on this topic.
Well, if it hasn't been clear yet, we're very focused on local issues, so making change locally. And I think that once we begin to have victories in our own communities around these issues and share them with, similarly minded groups in other communities, in other states, in other regions, then we can replicate what each other is doing and learn from each other's experiences. But I think it all has to start with, it's hard to organize for a cross-state issue. It's easier to organize for something in your own community that is controlled by your city council or your local planning commission. And that's how you start to build, community power and a voice on these issues, get a couple of victories under your belt, and then start to share that with other communities. That's part of, a big reason why in Just Action, for every example of a strategy or policy change that a group could advocate for, we give an example of a community that has successfully done it, because it's really important to learn from others' successes and then try to replicate them. And there's a lot of, important ways to do that, even across state lines. Now, every community is slightly different, every state is slightly different, but there's a lot that's the same. And so we can sort of work with what the opportunities and challenges and obstacles we have in our own communities first, and then start to expand that. Now, given that, we do have some regional, ideas of what can be done. And one is we have a chapter about the affirmatively furthering fair housing process, which is a process that jurisdictions have to go through to get federal funding for community development. And it's a comprehensive regional planning process that is supposed to or required to have robust community participation. And it should include, participation from school districts, from transportation agencies, from housing organizations and agencies, all sort of government agencies that serve the region, all community organizations that serve the region, and public participation. And through that planning process, they identify what the obstacles are to desegregating their region. So it's not just focused on a city, but the entire region, which is important. It's vital to really address segregation because it expands beyond a city's limits. And then what they can do to challenge and reduce those obstacles, and which agency or organization is in charge for each goal or strategy. So it's a very comprehensive planning process that can have a really regional focus. And we give an example from New Orleans that went through one of the first sort of comprehensive affirmatively furthering fair housing processes and identified, over 50 goals that they're now chipping away at to address all the obstacles to desegregation in that region. So that's another way people can get involved in larger efforts outside of their own smaller community.
Absolutely. And hopefully there will be also more instances for folks to get involved, knowing that there's a proposed rule for AFFH under that we should hopefully be hearing about, but soon.
Enacted soon.
We're all waiting on bated breath here. Well, I want to, thank you. I want to give you an opportunity if you have any sort of last thoughts, but I'm also turning it over to audience questions. And we do have one right now that I'll put out there. One of the audience members was wondering if you had any strong examples or practices to share of what this advocacy and action against segregation can look like in our increasingly multiracial society, when segregation is also just not a black and white issue anymore. And I'll pass it. Richard, do you want to take a first stab at this?
Sure. The unconstitutional and unlawful segregation that government created in the mid-20th century was primarily and almost exclusively directed to prevent African Americans from living near whites. But once those segregated neighborhoods were created, they affect other groups as well. When lower wage immigrants migrate to this country, they settle in segregated neighborhoods because those are the neighborhoods that exist. So if we didn't have African American inspired government segregation, those opportunities wouldn't be exclusively the only ones that immigrants had to settle in. The actions that we talk about, even though they are required as remedies for the segregation of African Americans, will benefit many others as well. For example, we devote a lot of attention in the book to reforms in the Section 8 program to permit Section 8 voucher holders to live in higher opportunity places with better resources. But of course, not all Section 8 voucher holders are African American. Mexican American immigrants, Mexican immigrants, and other Hispanics are also disproportionately represented in the Section 8 population, so they would benefit as well. And that's true of all of the programs that we talk about. They may be required constitutionally to remedy the segregation of African Americans, but they will benefit other lower income and minority groups as well.
Thanks. Go ahead, Leah.
I don't have much to add. Just in terms of examples, I mentioned the New Orleans affirmatively furthering fair housing process. That was a very multiracial, multi-ethnic process. It involved, everybody in New Orleans. And because it is a process where they have to really identify the sources or the causes of segregation and the obstacles, you can really connect the remedies to the specific policies that create that segregation. And those remedies and those policies might be different for different racial groups. And so it's just important to be specific when we're identifying solutions, as different sort of racial groups have suffered under different policies that created their segregation and maintain it. So that's one example.
Yeah, and I think these examples are powerful to go to how folks have started to organize. One of the questions that just came through was some residents. One of them that came through was, what can I do as a parent with kids in a mostly white, good New York City public school as a strong PTA, but a PTA that can raise money, but not like millions in other areas of New York City. I will add that the another question that one asked was, some residents believe that their voice don't matter. How can you get them engaged? So I think those two go hand in hand. So what can I do as a parent, but also, how do I get people engaged when they're kind of shrugging their shoulders and like, well, what can I do?
I can start.
I'll pass that over to Leah.
Okay. I would say as a parent, is sort of the same answer I would give as a resident of your community, which is the most important actions might be looking at how to open up your community to other people, to more diverse residents, to support, mixed income housing developments in your community, to counter the NIMBY, not in my backyard, opposition to new development in your community, to sort of open up the area you live to more diversity and advocate for the policy changes that are necessary to do that. And to what residents, when they believe their voices don't matter, I think this is sort of like the quintessential, like how do you organize people to get active and involved? And I think it's hearing examples of other resident groups that have had victories. It's learning the history and what the policies are that matter and how we can affect change on those, because all of the things we write about in Just Action are controlled on the local level. They're controlled by the city council, the planning commission, the local tax assessor, or local banks. They're all targets that are in our own communities that we actually do have a voice to influence. And so learning about how other communities have done that and how we can begin to, use that voice. And I think it's just kind of starting and then having some victories or having some experience that our voice can be heard is how we just start to build that movement.
Yeah, and I think that goes to often when we're working even with student organizing, I always emphasize celebrating the little wins, particularly on an issue that's like addressing segregation that's been around for quite some time. It can seem like such a daunting task, as you just mentioned, to really sort of think about how folks have like chipped away, even if it's like, I got parents for a dinner and there are parents from the community, going back to that PTA question. I know it's like, I got parents from a community to come to my living room to talk about integration, which is a lot. in celebrating that. I think we have time for 2 more questions. One is from Andrew Hairston, who is from Texas Appleseed. And he asked, as someone who was born in Winston-Salem, he loved hearing about the local example of the interracial dialogue. Leah, in your community organizing experience, how have folks generally thought about sustainability in this work, which certainly can extend across many generations?
Sure. I think this is also another, challenge of community organizing, but one that all community organizing has to confront, which is how to sustain the momentum and sustain involvement. And that example from Winston-Salem, Dad, correct me if I'm wrong, it was over several decades, right? That group was sustained, and how they did it is they had a commitment to being a racially balanced group, so equal numbers of whites and blacks. And if anybody needed to remove themselves from the group, they were replaced by someone of the same race. So they had a sustainability plan in place when the group was developed to ensure that it continued in the same racial balance, and it continued for a long, long time. So I think it's the I'm sorry I can't ever give like simple answers to these questions, because it's just the hard work of organizing and of I think placing this in context of it took so many decades of government policies to create the segregation that we're now trying to dismantle, that it's not going to be a quick fix. And so if we want to work on undoing it, we have to understand that it's a long process, and we'll have these smaller victories and they'll build. But if we're in it for the long, if we're in it for these goals and these ends, we sort of have to be in it for the long haul and think about it in that sustainable long-term way.
Yeah, go ahead. Richard, I'm also curious of your thoughts of also writing about this for so long, how you've seen people sustain these efforts through time.
Well, the best way to sustain efforts is to win victories. And the best way to win victories is to start small and let each small victory build to a larger one. I'll give you one example of something that any individual can do to sort of get their feet wet, to step in with their toes, and to becoming a more active participant in the struggle for residential desegregation. You probably know, or maybe not, that New York Appleseed, in 2019, Long Island Newsday did a study, which is online, in which they demonstrated in 50%, half of the interactions that African American home buyers had with real estate agents, they were discriminated against. And the same thing is true of renters who go to landlords. They are discriminated against unlawfully. It's all illegal, but it continues despite the Fair Housing Act. The way Long Island Newsday did this, and the way it's done in communities all over the country to a not adequate level, is they do something called paired testing. That is, they send both whites and blacks to a realtor, maybe to an apartment owner, with identical qualifications. The same financial background, same professional status, and they equally qualified to buy a home or rent an apartment, and they find that they're treated differently. And of course, ordinarily, a home buyer or a renter doesn't have any idea that they're being discriminated against. They don't know how other home buyers or renters are being treated. But the African American testers who went to these real estate companies were steered to black neighborhoods. The white testers were steered to white neighborhoods. The realtors disparaged white neighborhoods to black home seekers and disparaged black neighborhoods to white home seekers. Disparaged, yeah, they disparaged opposite race neighborhoods to home seekers. Well, there are fair housing centers that do this testing all over the country, and they can't do very much of it because they don't have enough volunteer testers. They don't have sufficient funds to do the background work that's necessary to create these identical identities. There are fair housing centers in New York and everywhere in the country that need volunteers. And if somebody just wants to get started, even before a community organization is created, and get their feet wet, volunteering to be a tester would be a good way to start.
Awesome. I always like when we are able to give one action that you can do right after. I think I'll end on this last audience question because I think it's a very common question that is asked often in these conversations. What about communities that don't want to integrate, but they want the resources they need to support themselves? Can we have equitable resource distribution without encouraging racial or ethnic integration? And I will pass that over to Leah to round us off.
Well, as I think we all know, we've never had separate and equal. And so as we increase resources in marginalized, under-resourced communities, which we should do, that is an essential step in this sort of redressing segregation movement, is increasing resources in segregated communities. As that happens, it's inevitable that those communities will start to integrate. And the only way to keep that from happening is to keep resources out of that community, and that's not an acceptable solution either. So what we argue is we need to, instead of sort of thinking we can prevent all integration, is we need to adopt policies and practices that prevent some of the displacement that occurs when this increase in investment happens. So there's a lot of policies that can help prevent some displacement, like inclusionary zoning policies that require that some of the new housing built is affordable to lower and moderate income households, community land trusts that build a permanently affordable housing in communities that are gentrifying, just cause eviction ordinances that make it illegal to evict tenants except for certain just causes, or rent regulations that protect renters from rapidly increasing rents, or starting a program that provides a right to counsel, a free right to an attorney for tenants facing an eviction. All of these can help prevent some of the displacement that will inevitably sort of the displacement pressure will inevitably happen when resources increase in these segregated communities. And so we have to sort of address both of those at the same time. But thinking that we can increase those investments without seeing any increase in other people coming into the community is just not how it's ever happened, and probably never will.
Thank you. Well, we are a little over time on our Q&A, and we didn't get to all the Q&A, but I will say thank you both so much for joining us in this conversation. I think it is obvious that our audience was incredibly engaged for the amount of questions that we have filtering through. we thank you for your time for this book. We will be sharing for everybody that is here the information for the Substack that you mentioned, but also where they can find the information on the book. And again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.